Today we're going to look at what I think is a very interesting topic, the rise of China and the implications for the U.S. I'm one of those who believe that there's no G20 or G8 or G7. It is G2. We currently have some issues, obviously, with Russia. In the greater scheme of things, clearly a downside risk, but I think it's kind of a sideshow, a diversion from the real 21st century issue, which is the relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China. It's unfortunate that where our president is right now, being somewhat distracted by these issues, because clearly the pivot, I'm sure he and many in his administration, and indeed many in America, would prefer that he had the full focus on Asia rather than having to deal with, and not only in Ukraine, but obviously what's happening in the Middle East and kind of no progress there. I'm going to make an assumption that what we all would prefer, mutually beneficial economic growth and development. That's good for everyone. And I'll keep coming back to that because I don't want to be misinterpreted as being anti-China. But I think this is a goal. And I've gone to extremes here, but could it somehow come to this? Could it really spin out of control and we end up with a conflict? I'm going to come back to that because John Mearsheimer, who's a very controversial, but I think a highly respected academic, he's at University of Chicago, this is his prediction of what's going to happen. And this is a man who's not off the wall, lunatic, crazy right, crazy left. His view is that it could spin out of control. Most of you are aware that this past century, the so-called American century, coined by the great American entrepreneur, Henry Luce, co-founder of the Time Life publishing empire, and back in 1941, a very prescient essay that he published in his own captive audience, of course, with his magazines. But as we were just beginning to see the implications of Hitler's march into Poland in September 1st, 1939. We were very reluctant to get involved, as we know. I think many of you perhaps don't remember well enough that the United States, the history was the history of isolationism, not the history of engagement. But the 9/11 of our grandparents' day, or parents' day, December 7th, 1941, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, we got involved. And Luce ended up saying what this is going to lead to. He says the United States is going to win. We're going to dominate militarily. We're going to dominate politically. We're going to dominate economically. We're going to dominate educationally. We're going to dominate culturally. Name the variable, he said, the United States will dominate. And for all intents and purposes, the 20th century was the American century. I always find it interesting that Luce himself never set foot in the United States till he was 15 years old. He was a child of American missionaries, and he grew up in China. Well, there's no doubt that the last century was ours. But a slide that some of you have seen, and this is where maybe we lose our lunch, world history for dummies. The history of the modern world is not the history of the rise, and rise of a nation. It is the history of the rise and fall of nations. The first modern nation state, Spain, 16th century, leveraging Portuguese navigational technology. They came here and they found you. They found Indians in West India. They found the New World. Built up, huge empire as we know, but they couldn't hang on to it. By the end of the 16th century, Spain was over, done, stick a fork in it. 17th century, Holland. The classic nation that punches above its weight. They were the dominant nation. What was the original name of New York City? New Amsterdam. Australia till the middle of the 19th century? New Holland. Just to the east of New Holland, New Zealand. To the west of Australia, Indonesia. Dutch colony for 350 years. Powerful. But small, overextended, couldn't maintain it. The golden age of Holland, 30, maybe 40 years at most. 18th century, France. They began to build their empire. Quebec, Louisiana, West Indies, Other parts, a little bit later, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, they were powerful. They couldn't maintain it. That Napoleon literally meets his Waterloo in 1815, they're defeated. The 19th century, the greatest empire in history. The sun never set on the British Empire. 40% of the world's landmass under the dominion of the city. History was over, but what happened there? By the time World War I was over, the UK was a spent force, could not afford to pay down the debt it had taken on, had to sell off its empire. And as the Brits vacated from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America, from the Middle East, and ultimately from North America as well, we had a 20-year hiatus, a 20-year vacuum. Who was going to really be in charge? Only one nation had the potential, but again, the long history of isolationism. The United States couldn't rise to the occasion, too much opposition. It took Pearl Harbor to do that. And since that time, Luce's words, they were prescient. We were the domination by far. But when you look at this, and history is not physics, but what is it? What goes up must come down. Is it over? A long run? And is the 21st century, when you spool the tape forward 50, 80, 100 years from now, will the 21st century be referred to as an extension of the American century, or will some other nation, its name be put in its place? When you look at the largest economies today in purchasing power parity, pushing $90 trillion. We remain the largest, but in purchasing power parity, China has moved up to number 2. India beginning to move right now. This was about a year ago. India has certainly not done as well since. But you look at these, the countries in red are the emerging markets, and EMs have been the name of the game for the last decade or so. When you look at population, if you're a business person, growth, good or bad, is what it's all about. You constantly have to grow. And you look at this is the future. This is where the markets are. 3+ billion individuals have come into the game because of globalization. By the way, all of these slides are available from whatever site that is available for you guys to get them. About what? We're here about this. I'm not into myself on this. I'll say that. I teach here. Paul Tiffany is my name. Right behind you, Amar will tell you. Amar's only here because I haven't graded him yet for his course. He's the one taking notes. On this, we see these numbers there. That is a good question, though. I teach here. I teach in the strategy and global strategy. I taught in China for 5 years, not full time, at CEIB, CEIBS, China Europe International Business School. Whatever it's worth, they claim to be the #1 business school in China. It's not a real university like Tsinghua or Beijing or Fudan. It's strictly a business school, but it's very highly rated. And I found it interesting to go there. They wanted to get accredited, AACSB, and to do that, you need to have a huge proportion of faculty have to be full-time. It was hard to get people to go there. So now, I haven't been there for 3 or 4 years. I go to China a lot, but haven't taught there because I don't want to move to Shanghai. If I did, I'd starve because I would be afraid to eat anything. But that's a different story. We'll come back to that. But when you look at this again, the growth, the markets, bodies, people who want to consume things, the emerging markets are where things are at. It's interesting that right now we're awfully close to this. It really started in April, and we shouldn't let this out of our memory. This was the low point in the history of China's Communist Party, is what happened there. And it's interesting how, if you look back, I remember this. I was in Hong Kong at the time. I was doing a talk there. I was there a couple days, and there was a march in Central that went on for 10 hours of people just furious there. And we saw the revulsion here in the United States, in the West, but I think a lot of us have forgotten what happened there. And I think it's a backdrop I want to come back to. How has that country been able to overcome that? I think values ultimately do count. and those are not just the values of making money. I'm painting somewhat of a picture here of China. This certainly isn't a complete portrait, but money, status, linkage to prestige, very much in play there. Hard work in order to get money, to get the above. Loyalty to family and clan, more so than other things perhaps. And when we look at the values that most of us are familiar with, indeed looking at here, many of you in my just doing visual approach here, were not raised in this country, but much of what attracted you to the United States, I think, were some of these values that continue to be a magnet for people around the world. We have a lot of problems here, I'll come back to that, but some of these values continue to resonate. Democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of religious belief, individual rights, pluralistic society, etc., many of those which don't play in China. The modern China is a function of January, February 1949. Mao finally drives the Kuomintang into the sea in Taiwan, in which they invade Taiwan, kill 25,000 people, and declare Taiwan now to be the Republic of China. That term, the first Republic of China, Chiang Kai-shek, or pardon me, Sun Yat-sen, in 1911, the last emperor dies. He's able to unify it, creates the Republic of China. But never able to really cement it in. Warlords throughout, never able to really create centralized power. He died, very unfortunately, of cancer in the mid-1920s, and his brother-in-law, Chiang Kai-shek, takes over, doesn't have nearly the skill, the capability, or anything of Sun Yat-sen, and he engages in this a long fight. He's finally driven out in 49, and Mao takes over. Mao was the revolutionary. When Mao took over, the relationship of China and the Soviet Union was not perfect in a lot of ways. But Mao was the person who invented the term, which we don't use anymore, politically incorrect, but third world country. He said the first world, that's the United States and the Soviet Union. Second world, there are some European countries, a few others. Third world, that's the rest of us. But we, he said, will become a first world country. And we'll do it by emulating the rapid industrialization that occurred in the Soviet Union. 1917, the revolution occurs in St. Petersburg. It was an agrarian nation. 20 years later, it's one of the most industrialized nations in the world. Mao says we can do the same thing. And the program he puts together, the Great Leap Forward, as it was called. The Great Leap Forward was one of the greatest leaps backwards in modern history. Much of what actually happened was hidden. But Mao's view was that we rapidly have to industrialize. Farmers, melt down your farm implements. City dwellers, melt down your kitchenware, your stoves, your pots and pans. We'll build backyard iron kilns and whatnot. Some drought, some other things occurred. The left has always had some issues between means and ends. To get to this glorious endpoint, unfortunately, half of you are going to have to die. But let's not dwell on that part. But in that context, a lot of this stuff, it destroyed the country. The 20th century was one of the bloodiest centuries in history. You look back at World War I, at World War II, at the Holocaust, at some of these other conflicts. At the top end, 60 million perhaps perished in the Great Leap Forward. At the bottom end, non-negotiable, 25 to 30 million at least, because it was just not a well-defined and certainly not a well-executed plan. Mao did not want to reveal some of the problems in the country. We're going to be a modern nation. We're going to export stuff. They had huge droughts. People were starving. Take the foodstuffs that had been harvested, send it abroad. There are studies, not a lot, and I shouldn't say studies, confirmations, not a lot. Cannibalism was going on. People were dying. Millions and millions were dying. Well, it didn't work. In the mid-60s, Mao said, let's go to Plan B. He launches a second one called the Cultural Revolution. He destroyed China again. Not as bad, this time only 3 million died. In 1976, thank God, Mao finally dies himself. And he had kind of eviscerated much of the leadership there. The so-called Gang of Four takes over, one of whom, by the way, his fourth wife, a very beautiful thespian, an actress from Shanghai, who almost immediately orders his still living ex-wife to be executed, to get her out of the picture totally. Well, the Gang of Four was a gang that couldn't shoot straight, didn't have a clue of what to do. And finally, almost in desperation, they turned to a man, Deng Xiaoping. Mao was a revolutionary, but Deng Xiaoping was the nation builder. Up there, perhaps, Lee Kuan Yew, Otto von Bismarck, one of the great statespeople, modern nation builders of the last 100 some years. He was never truly trusted by Mao. Mao used to say to his colleagues, I think little Deng is actually a capitalist roader. He wants to go down the road of, he hasn't sufficiently imbibed the Kool-Aid of communism. Mao's presumptions indeed were correct. The Communist Party was started in China in 1921. The revolution occurred in Russia in 1917. Small group of people. They wanted to make it a better country. The landlords owning everything. It's interesting, Mao himself, he came from a peasant family, but his father owned land, which is unusual for a peasant family. And they were going to transform, to bring power to the people, to strip the small cadre of well-to-do landowners of all that they had. Well, they didn't have a lot of followers, didn't have a lot of money, and in the late 20s, they said, we have to learn more about this glorious system. And they chose one of their new members, Deng Xiaoping. He wanted to make China a better place for its citizens. So they put together a small budget, and they say, go off to Paris and sit at the very appropriately named left bank. Go to the talks, go to the lectures, learn more about Marxism, learn more about this glorious system, bring it back, and be the Sendai, be the individual to train us more in what's going on. Well, he goes off there. Paris was, Paris is, Paris always will be a very expensive city. His budget is limited. Food's high, housing, etc. How's he going to support himself on this very small budget? He comes up with a great idea. He opens and operates a takeout Chinese restaurant in Paris. And he learns perhaps what became maybe the most modern saying, quotation in modern China. Who cares? He's referring, using the analogy of the countryside, and he's referring obviously to communism and capitalism. He says, who cares if the cat is black or the cat is white? Who cares whatever the system you call it? As long as the cat can catch the mouse, that's all that matters. He was not an ideologue. I don't call it whatever you want, but if the damn system doesn't work, put in a system that does. Very pragmatic. He begins to put those policies in play. Timing is always critical. He comes in 1970, late 78, early 79. Japan is beginning to rise up. Asian countries, American businesses, Western businesses are getting devastated. Lower cost, better quality. Much of our business infrastructure, classic American FD&H syndrome, fat, dumb, and happy. They were there, hey, life is good, nobody doing anything, not really focusing on the challenges of Japan and others. And Mao now, or Deng Xiaoping, offers the opportunity of the millions, the billions, the trillions of cheap labor to Western firms. Great, but how is Deng Xiaoping going to lure them? Comes up with a great idea, SEZ, Special Economic Zones. If you were in business in China at the time and made profit, not necessarily a good thing. Tax on profitable business was 85% you were paying in. Western firms were not going to go there under those circumstances. If you come to a special economic zone defined, first one in Shenzhen, 0 taxes, 5 years, maximum 15% after that, and look at all the cheap labor. But you must bring technology, you must bring capital. Well, the seduction, the lure, the magnetism of that was overwhelming. Firms began to pour in. They took advantage of it. And China begins to grow. And these special economic zones begin to spread. This is clearly working. Western capital, Western technology now can begin to confront the rise of other Asian economies which had been challenging the hegemony of the West in economic matters. Well, as they spread, Deng Xiaoping was the real creator. He steps down in 1991, and Jiang Zemin had been named mayor of Shanghai in 1985 by the party. He was Shanghainese, and he works on Deng Xiaoping. He says, you know, if you really want to restore the glory of China, you've got to restore Shanghai. Shanghai was the Queen City of China. It was one of the great capitals of the world up until the revolution. It was China's industrial capital, it was China's commercial capital, it was China's financial capital, it was its shipping capital, it was its cultural capital. It was the largest city in China. But the Shanghainese, when Mao came to power, many of them fled. They were the real entrepreneurial class of China. Much of modern Taiwan and to a degree Hong Kong were really modern, created by the fleeing Shanghainese. Mao was not happy. Let that city rot. They're traitors. They aren't loyal to our glorious cause. Zheng Zemin, named mayor, says, we've got to restore Shanghai to its past. You'll never achieve your goals until that. In 1989, Deng Xiaoping approves, and Shanghai is named a special economic zone at Pudong across the Hangpo River. And with that, this transformation. And many of you have been to Shanghai, not the most modern city in China, the most modern city in the world. Just overnight, this massive, massive expansion that went on. I did work with the municipal government of China in 2007 or 2008, and this was taken off their website. It said Shanghai 2013. The minister, they said, no, we're going to have this in 6 months. 2013 will be double the size. You could laugh it off, but in fact, that was the reality. Just amazing growth that went on. Zheng Zemin went in until 1980, until 2001, then Hu Jintao chosen. Unlike what's happening in Russia, you're in for 5 years, you get reelected, 100% of the vote, and then you're another 5 years, but then you're 10 and you're out. You don't try to do a coup to stay in. We haven't seen that so far, and I would certainly give China credit for that. Zheng Zemin was a good soldier, had some flair for publicity and whatnot, kept the wheels turning, even talked a little bit about putting in some democracy at the party level at the lowest levels. Hu Jintao came in, a gray bureaucrat, presided over this incredible expansion, but didn't put much of a stamp on things since then. And this growth has just been overwhelming. Many of you have been there, taken from M on the Bund, and if you've been to that place, one of the really good restaurants there, this woman, Michelle, an Australian, runs an incredible place. You get these spectacular views of the Pearl Tower and now the beer opener building. That will appeal to some of your colleagues. Some of this other stuff there. If you've been there, you look at Manhattan. This makes Manhattan look like a little suburban place comparatively. It's overwhelming, the growth that they've had. And it's not been limited to Shanghai. Over 160 cities in China, population over 1 million. Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Tianjin, Chongqing. How many of you have heard most of these? Nobody outside of China has ever heard of them. There are 5 million people living there. Huge, huge growth that's gone on throughout China. And Hu Jintao did his 5+5, and the most recent, last year, or the year before, named as the new President Xi Jinping, a so-called princeling, son of one of the revolutionaries, and connections, Guanxi, are absolutely critical in China. He's in now. His second wife, one of the most famed, a popular singer within China, perhaps the most well-known member of the military. And the question, what does he see as the relationship between China and the United States? And that remains the issue. What does this person want? When the smoke goes up over the Vatican and a new pope is named, it's a lot easier to figure out what happened than it is to figure out how the new person in China got there. There's simply lack of transparency. What is this person? You don't run on a platform. Here's what I want for China. Here's what I want for the citizenry. You're simply there. We don't know what the agenda is. When we look at it, and I'm going to come back to that momentarily, certainly China is just, as I said, gaudy statistics, incredible rise, just mind-blowing how rapidly. One reason, by the way, why China is obviously so critical, you have to go back to the late 19th century to see anything comparable. What happened then? Roughly 1870 to 1900. 30 years, historically speaking, the snap of fingers. The United States went from being a rural, agrarian, interesting new nation to, by 1900, the most industrialized nation in the world, the most powerful nation in the world. 30 years it happened like that, and we saw what happened. The 20th century was the American century. China, nobody has done what the US did until China has done it in the last 20 years. Is this indicative of the changes we've talked about? Will China dominate the 21st century? Certainly the population is large, but the growth population is one of the slowest in the world. And part of that, I'll say something momentarily, we all know the reason why, is because of the one-child policy. Savings rates are astronomical compared to the West. From around the mid-60s up until this century, personal consumption as a percentage of GDP in the United States was about 65, 67%. After the recovery from 9/11, it ramped up to about 72%. Much of the other advanced economies, certainly in Europe, personal consumption as a percentage of GDP is in the low to high 50%. In China, it was in the 20s until a few years ago percent. It's now up to maybe 33, 34%. So there's a lot of savings. A lot of the savings is cultural. It is also abetted by public policies, tax policies, etc. Why do a lot of Americans spend money on houses? That's how you get a great tax break off of mortgage interest and property taxes. Most other nations do not allow that. We have tax policies that encourage consumption a lot. And in America, you are what you wear, what you drive, what you eat, where you live, where your kids go to school. This overwhelming sense of having these things. China has a lot of cultural factors of savings, but the rates are dramatically higher, as they are in much of Asia. Dynamic economy, 800 million strong labor force, rising level of education, and in the STEP type of issues. They're not studying sociology like my kids did, totally unemployable, who went here, by the way. But and part of it also, in China today, a will to win. Unlike Japan in the 1980s, the century of humiliation is over when the variety of the foreign devils invaded China and dictated terms policy. That is over. It's our turn. We're going to win. It's palpable, that sense of pride that you see in China today. Busy slide, and again, these are all available. I'm certainly not going to go over all of these, but again, some of these numbers out there. Foreign reserves, $3.8 trillion. This is just unheard of historically, that amount of money. Still a lot of folks in agriculture of the nearly 800 million strong workforce. Currency, I want to come back to that. Is the currency manipulated? Depends on who you talk to, but I have some views on it. GDP per capita, again, something I'll say very quickly momentarily. Most of you have visited China. There's two Chinas. You've only seen one of the Chinas. You've seen the East Coast, the Guangdong and Fujian and Shanghai, the rapidly industrializing, urbanized East. You go to the Western provinces, you're in a different planet. To say there's a per capita GDP in China is like saying the average temperature in the United States today is 68 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a totally meaningless number given the size. Same thing in China. The growth has been in the eastern provinces, initially because of the access to deep water ports, harbors, access to the west. You go into the west, into the western provinces, you have per capita income perhaps of under $1,000 US in many parts of that. So there's a real difference there, and that has a real impact on what China's been trying to do and what it is doing. Let me back up one thing on that, because I want to say something on this. Is there a huge financial and real estate bubble in China today? Again, almost any economic data one gets from China has to be held in suspicion. It's almost like Argentina. You don't know how much the books have been cooked because of that. Yeah, a lot. If it's Argentina, don't believe. Whatever they say in Argentina, if it's positive, that means it's only half. If it's negative, that means it's double, sort of thing. we don't have, and part of it is not, it's maybe omission instead of commission, just the lack yet of an infrastructure that can accurately collect that kind of information and format it and make it available. But as of 2 years ago, 65 million unoccupied housing units in China. Not 6.5 million, not 65 million unoccupied. And we've seen this, we've gotten a lot of coverage in the West here, the ghost cities, whole cities built with literally nobody living there. Was it a housing bubble? And a lot of the problems in the financial bubble, how much of what's going on is off the books? A lot of lending, either person to person or banks, other financial institutions lending off the balance sheet, so to speak. And we don't know the impact of those. But there are some issues out there. The World Bank did an interesting study a couple of years ago. They said if you look historically, up there the growth rate, per capita GDP. But then they saw it trending down. Now part of this is obvious. You cannot grow like that forever. It's the law of large numbers if nothing else. But we're also beginning to see what's happening literally, the most recent data. The 7.8% projected GDP, down to 7.7, down to 7.6, now down to 7.4. I mean, put it in our perspective, oh my God, how terrible, only 7.4%. But in China, that is, symbolically, it's really bad. Why? It's under 8%. 8 is the magic number for a number of reasons. But it's been dropping on that. And what is this going to lead to? Is the great growth is over and it's now falling into a more normalized pattern? Issues to see. Certainly lots of problems ahead. I've alluded to some of these. Long-term energy sufficiency remains a problem. No matter what we think about fossil fuel, energy remains the driving force of modernization of economies. China's been punctured like a pincushion, but for whatever reason, the dinosaurs said, we ain't dying in China. And they've had trouble finding some carbon resources there. But the need for energy is overwhelming. It's why the Three Gorges Dam, the largest construction project in modern history, trying to capture hydroelectric power, other forms of energy seeking on that. Infrastructural development and the pollution that went with it have overtaken the U.S. in railroad trackage. Getting close to overtaking the United States in freeway type expressway mileage, just incredible expansion, airports everywhere, and the problems that go with it, as we know. Quality and safety issues on products, we read a lot about those, very real. Lots of excess investment in state-owned enterprise and overcapacity there. I want to come back to that because SOEs remain a decent part of the economy. Why is that important? That's where the politicians get their money, is by milking those. That's the source of this incredible amount of wealth that the political elite has in China today. Certainly the demographic imbalance, aging population. When Deng Xiaoping came to power, he said rather correctly, if you have an economy growing like that and population growing like that, they cancel. So what did he put in? The one-child policy. And for a number of reasons, cultural and economic, and this is not just China, but in much of Asia, male children are preferred. The name goes through them. In China, until 1950, a female could not inherit property. The law was changed in 1950, but a law is only as good as it's enforced. And in much of rural parts of China, the enforcement still wasn't there, is that any inheritance only goes to a male. And if you only have one child, money counts. Geez, I got a girl. In the 1990s, the so-called missing millions, that millions unaccounted for. If you look at a normal, if you look at, leave it to human nature, there'll be slightly more male children born, about 50.1, 50.2% to females, because male children tend to die a bit more at an early age. It should balance. But in China, it got to about 110, 115 to 100. What was happening here? Clearly, this was not something natural. Obviously, we know. Abortion, highest rate in the world in China. Amniocentesis, other methodologies, technologies for gender prediction, highest in China. And for a long time, if you went to an orphanage, you never saw a young male. Today, there are males there. Which ones? The ones that have physical deformities that are picked up through modern technology and either aborted or put into an orphanage. So it creates a problem. We're getting there now where you have this a rather wide discrepancy between males and females. I remember when I was in Hong Kong, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, there was an article. And literally, the article, the translation said, the problem we're going to have in China, it was written by a very respected demographer in China. He says, we're going to have millions and millions and millions of horny young men. They will never find a female mate. They never are going to. If you look at some of the implications of that, if you look at crime in almost all societies, overwhelmingly crime is committed by males between 18 and 25 in almost all categories. That's where, testosterone, growing up, all this stuff, overwhelmingly crime comes from a certain cohort of young males. There are issues like that to deal with, and clearly going forward. China, the largest population in the world, has talked about how do we import population. They don't want you, they want you. They want to bring in women. So some issues there that remains to be seen. And finally, these looming structural adjustments. Yes. If you were Chinese, check his wallet. On this, the move now, China's economy has been an export-led economy, and the need now to stimulate internal consumption. And again, it goes back to cultural issues as much as anything else. Political issues, corruption throughout the government, especially at the lower levels. Governance system, I'm biased, I think, but I don't think you can control an economy of $12, $13 trillion, 1.3 plus billion people from a handful of bureaucrats sitting in Beijing. They think they can do that. I don't think they can. And much of the breaking the rules, it's almost the further you're away from Beijing, the more the rules are not respected. I remember being there a couple years ago, and I was told about Hainan Airlines. Started there, kind of resort line. Fastest growing airlines in all of China. That was the good news. Bad news, there was no such airline. There was an airline there, but they'd never been licensed. They were not official. Somebody said, let's start an airline. Entrepreneur went to the province in Hainan, maybe paid off because to create growth, they started an airline. They're not officially recognized. They have since. But a lot of these things going on. Certainly Taiwan remains an issue. And this is non-negotiable, what I saw in China, top down to the bottom. Was ours, is ours, will be ours. End of discussion. And that remains an issue. The United States has a treaty. We will come to the defense of Taiwan if they're invaded. But only America do this. We have that treaty. But when Reagan was in office in 1986, what was his comment? Taiwan belongs to Greater China. He acknowledged that. Now, wait a minute. They're an independent nation, but they belong. You figure it out. But this is an issue. The other thing I would point out, I have never once met an American citizen said, I'm willing to send my child to die for Taiwan. That remains an issue. We might extend that. Would you go to die for Ukraine? But there's an issue with Taiwan on that. What is happening on that? And certainly the historical Japanese friction is coming back. China dominated Asia for 1,000 years. And as Japan began to rise up in the late 19th century, at the same time, China was trending stable, then south. And as Japan became the dominant nation in much of the 20th century, now it's reversal time. And we see this constant tension between those two nations. You see it every day in the news about certain islands and whatnot, and it goes to places other than that. Some of you were in my class, you might remember we did that SK2 case, which the Procter & Gamble, a product from Japan, facial care, very popular in China. Then suddenly, even though it was owned by an American firm, P&G, the Chinese government said, they're terrible ingredients in it, your face will burn off if you use it, get them all off the shelf. Nothing to do with the product, everything to do with the fact that Japan had published a first and second grade textbook that did not sufficiently acknowledge, or in fact it wouldn't acknowledge at all, that Japan had anything to do with World War II. Instead it was all started by China. So they became the pawn in that. And those issues are still just beneath the surface very much. And certainly rising issues with the United States. Come back to that. The build-up, The fastest growing percentage-wise military budget in the world remains China. The official Chinese position, not to worry, the peaceful rise of China. Then why is it getting so big? This remains an interesting issue. Why is China building its military capacity relative to the rest of the world so rapidly? The first response from China, certainly a legitimate response. Look at the numbers. They claim they're up to about 60, 70 billion a year. We claim it's really double that if you look at a lot of other factors that perhaps aren't counted. But then the counter, okay, double it. What's our military budget annually? 650 billion, and again, that doesn't count certain areas. Easily 5 times larger. The military budget in the United States greater than the next 10 countries combined. So there's a pushback. So there's one level on that. But why would they build it up? To project power to Taiwan. I don't care how many F-16s, F-18s, anything that you get from the United States, forget it. It's over. It's done. You're not going to be free. You're going to come back. Maybe that's it, project power. Another interpretation, China is dependent upon what? A constant stream of tankers coming into ports to dispense raw materials and goods necessary to the continued economic growth of China. Where do those ships come from? Across the sea. Who protects the sea lanes of the world? The United States Navy. If you're China, do you want to be dependent on the United States to keep your economic lifelines open? Perhaps if we were in their shoes, that might be a legitimate issue. We've got to build up, because what are they starting to build? They're starting to build a blue water navy, starting to build a navy that can project power outside the coastal zone, certainly beyond that. And maybe a third interpretation, the coming Armageddon, the coming fight with the power in the West America, and we have to be prepared. Depending on your political views, perhaps you come down on one of those. But on the last one again, we're back to the issue, lack of transparency. What is the long-term military policy of China that is leading to this, relatively speaking, rapid growth? In 2012, the first aircraft carrier, if you want to project power militarily, other than nuclear weaponry, you do it with aircraft carriers. We had about 14, we're down to 12. Nobody else has more than 2. China, I got this, does anybody know where this came from? The Ukraine. It was being built by the Soviet Union. 91, Soviet Union falls apart. It sat there in a shipyard for 6 years, more than that, didn't do anything. A Hong Kong businessman said, we need hotel space. I want to buy this, make it a floating hotel in Hong Kong. Oh, okay, they sold it. 6 months later, it showed up in a Shanghai shipyard being retrofitted for what it was built for, to be China's first aircraft carrier on that. And they're learning. The initial reaction of the United States, it's not a threat. When we had our first real carriers, the big ones, in the 1950s, the number 786 crashes, because hard to land, learn how to land at night on a bobbing small little piece of metal out in the middle of the ocean. 786 crashes. In the view of the US, it'll take them a decade to develop those capabilities. They've learned a lot faster because technology is better. But why do they want this? Is it for these reasons we talked about? Project power, maintain sea lines? They're beginning to expand on that, and it remains an issue. But what does China want out of this? This remains the issue, that slide I had earlier with Xi Jinping. The hope is that he's a reformer who will guide China through domestic transformation and a responsible statecraft. But the fear is that he's just another nationalist. He set China on an aggressive course, bullying its neighbors and confronting. Now, those are 2 endpoints. Which is real? What do you look to? There, again, is not a lot of studies, white papers, etc. There is lack of clarity in that, in much of that. He has talked about the Chinese dream. He consciously positioned that, not the American dream, but the Chinese dream. The 2 100s, moderately well-off society by 2020, the 100th anniversary of the party, and the modernization to become fully developed nation on the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic. Strong China economically, politically, diplomatically, scientifically, militarily, civilized, equity, fairness, culture, morals, harmonious, amity among social classes and the different ethnic groups, And finally, beautiful China, environmentally low pollution, etc. Nice talk, achievable, or sugar-coated PR to mollify people while the secret agenda continues to expand the military for a coming confrontation? Who knows? When you look at nations, those of you involved in cross-border investment, some of the obvious things aside from basic returns, the financial tools you use, the nation, population, growth prospects, etc. You look at institutions, the private property rights if you're going to make an investment, credit institutions, judicial system, fairness and equity, political stability, political risk is still an issue, certainly with what's been going on around the world, that comes up. And then obviously, does this going into this nation fit with the strategy, et cetera, that I'm trying to achieve? Standard types of issues that come up there. But what we don't look enough, I think, and this is my view, nothing more, where are we examining what type of nation is this? What are its systems? What are its long-term goals, socially, politically, militarily? Are they in conformance what we think should be the role of a nation in modern society, or is there something else going on? Some of these things I've already talked about. Those values, I think, ultimately count. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I think some of these, my own views, I think transparency has to expand in China. Somewhat is happening, but I'd like to see it faster, but is it just at the margin, not enough? These two regions that I've talked about, the two Chinas, the rural, a long way from modernization, and then the rapidly enriched eastern seaboard areas. Continuing trade tensions, and that ties into valuation of the currency. And there's all of these linked together in an interesting way. The currency, the RMB or yuan, was, before it was defined by government, it was 8.27 to the dollar, fixed exchange rate. That was clearly undervaluing the currency, clearly, everybody knew that. And when Bush's second administration, as our own trade data, trade statistics began to really go south, look bad, we put a lot of pressure on China to do something. They finally said, okay, you're right, we're going to change it, 8.16. No, that went for a few months, so they said, okay, we give up, 8.1 run. And after some pressure, they went to a floating basket. Well, it began to drift down. The currency appreciated by 20%. Got down to about around 6 or so, something like that. And this is, again, it's maybe a lot of the issues with economics. There's no clear perception or sense or view by economists as to whether it's undervalued or overvalued. Many whom I think are very respected financial economists said it's got to go 4-to-1 to really make it, because it's a non-tradable. It's not a convertible currency. You don't go to the London Currency Exchange and see what the value is. It is still more or less dictated by government, that little bandwidth. But question, we can argue about the technicalities over under, but why has it been undervalued so much? In order to make Chinese goods cheap in global markets. So that you go to a Walmart where not that long ago, 80% of what was sold in Walmart in the United States was made in China. People see these, we had tough economic times, prices are good, we buy them. Okay, we buy them, then what? They get orders to fill the factories in China. And they get more orders, they hire more people. People come in from the West, from the agrarian areas, they now get jobs, they get into the game. Why do they want to do that? Social unrest. Social unrest is a euphemism. A word you and I would use is riot. That the government used to track and publish the incidences of social unrest in China. In 1995, more or less 5,000 recorded incidences. When they stopped reporting it in 2010, it had gotten up to 135,000 incidences for the prior year. I had read that it's about 155,000 now. The last time it was reported, 2010, epiphenomenon, collateral damage of the social unrest, 2,500 local party officials had been beaten to death, killed by outraged local people, especially in the western provinces. Now, why is that? They see this gaudy, incredible development along the eastern seaboard. There are roughly 385 million households in China. There are about 430 million television sets in China. And even in the West, with the little pizza pan type of satellite dishes, they can pick up reception. They see this incredible wealth in these cities. And then they look around at their own circumstances and says, there's something wrong with this picture. That imagine you're at this incredible dining experience, beautiful tapestries on the wall, the best French wine, beautiful linens, china, liveried people waiting on you, Australian steak, incredible food. And then just outside the window are these people in kind of torn clothes with their dirty little fingers and noses pushed up against looking in. There's something wrong here. That they are furious because developers come in. You cannot buy land in China. You get a lease up to varying time, maybe up to 70 years. In the Western provinces, that's where the farmers do their farming. The party officials, they say, get off. We're turning it over to developers. Well, where are we going to go? Your problem, dude, not mine. Not happy. They allow chemical firms to come in, start doing chemicals, dump the shit into the rivers, into the aquifers. The water's no longer drinkable. Your problem, not mine. And they see their local officials. The girlfriend now has a Mercedes, or they've got a condo somewhere in Shenzhen, and the local official has a lot of money now. They are furious at what's going on. They see the corruption in their face. Much of Asia, and certainly China, Confucian legacy, a very strong legacy of education. Education counts. You can essentially buy your way into any school in China. At lower levels, you can buy the grades of your child so he or she can move up. Now, again, just time out on this. Did George W. get into Yale because of his brain power? Now, no, I just wanted to, just to make that as a comparison, that we perhaps are more subtle. I'm not saying we do it, but there it's outright, you pay to play. And people know that. They know education counts. And they said, this isn't right. When I was there, I saw it, these people over and over and over. This is not right what's going on. This corruption has got to stop. And Xi Jinping knows it. But again, is he the reformer? Or is it throwing some bones to those who are upset so we continue on? These things are all related. In some of these I've talked about. The future then, soft landing, it works out well, the reforms come in, maybe not as fast as I or some of you would want them, but it's a process. You don't make changes like that overnight. Or is it going to be a hard landing? Is that the situation simply doesn't resolve itself fast enough? At the upper levels of the political elite in China, the wealth is unbelievable. It is unbelievable, the wealth that's there. Derived primarily from SOEs. That's why they're slow to reform. This is the source of millions and millions and millions of dollars for public officials. Wen Jiabao was the number 2, the premier under Hu Jintao. And when his prior job, he was the head of a financial agency. And Ping An, one of the largest insurance firms in the world, it was privatized. Well, the New York Times, its reporters now, their visas are not being renewed. Because they wrote some stories how Wen Jiabao's wife has $2.3 billion US. She's a school teacher. And Wen Jiabao's response, she does? I wonder where she got that. You're kidding. Yeah, right. Nobody believes that. Where does that wealth? People who are level, you don't give that up easily. You just don't do it. And there, how do they let go? Will the party let go? Will the party give up this control of just streams of wealth? Maybe interesting little factor too, Xi Jinping, where does his daughter go to school? Harvard College. Hu Jintao, where does his sister live, the prior? Silicon Valley. A study, a little poll, clearly not scientific. Chinese millionaires a year ago. What do you want most? Number 1, get my children out of the country. Number 2, get my money out of the country. This is the elite who's doing well. Is this what you want? Where the number 1 goal is to get out before it crashes. These are worries there. When I taught at CEBS, my students said, no landing, mid-air refueling, we're going to grow, 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 grow. That part I don't think. I think it's certainly, I don't think it's going to be soft, and hopefully not a hard landing on that. Who wins then going forward? The 21st century. The BRICS, yeah, right. Brazil is the country of the future, and it always will be. Yeah, India, I said the 21st century, so India may be slow, and European community every day an oxymoron on that. I wouldn't count out the United States just yet. Again, we're going against the tide in terms of ability of a nation to dominate long term. Near the end, I think we should keep in mind change usually occurs very slowly. The so-called climacteric of the British economy was 1877. It took another 30, 40 years before it really realized, my God, we got problems. So it's not as if you fall off a cliff 90 degrees and it's over. It's usually, the UK now is certainly a strong economy, but it peaked 140 years ago. Today, too, good news, bad news, we live in interesting times. Tremendous amount of uncertainty. My little joke, and I interpret this the right way, who's the greatest philosopher in the world? The great Chinese philosopher. Who knew? We just don't know. Who knew what was going on? So much uncertainty out there. The ability to predict events was much greater. It's much harder today because of tremendous uncertainty. If you were an investor with surplus capital, late 19th century, looking at emerging markets, Canada, Australia, Argentina, the United States, maybe Germany too, they were equal bets. If you had bet on Argentina, you've got a lot of problems. Looking today, is China going to be it? And some of these other countries, it's harder to predict these things, that history plays tricks on us in some ways. Again, I'm not going to go over this in detail. I do want to leave a few moments here, Q&A, very few. But my own very subjective analysis, economic growth, political stability, human rights, population growth, level of educational attainment, military strength, natural resource locally, environmental sustainability, financial strength. These are grades I give. And just to show them with the next one, I do have some weights on those. But I look at those, and even now I would revise them some, but China is not running away. Maybe a basic point that I don't know if I'm making with clarity, I want you to focus on more than growth in financial strength. There's more to a nation than that. There are a lot of these other social, political, environmental factors that have to be brought into the equation, not just on the numbers. Also, as many emerging markets have learned, it's really hard to move into sustained middle income stance. Early stage economic growth often is reflected far more in currency appreciation, bond valuation, but not in per capita income. China remains today, if you look at it per capita, it's not a rich country. It's very poor. We have one of the highest, we're not the highest, but we certainly have more. Emerging market growth, as we're learning very much now, why is China slowing down? Because the West is slowing down. We're not buying the stuff. This is an integrated economy these days, and it's hard to have one nation growing dramatically if the customer nations with whom they trade are having problems. And then again, the difficulty of sustainability. Greece, Ireland, Spain, Ireland, the Celtic tiger was going to boom, basket case in many respects. I mentioned at the beginning, and this guy, John Mearsheimer, he is controversial, but he's academically very well respected. Much of his reputation in the late 1990s is that there's going to be a huge event in the Middle East that will shake the world. Maybe he got lucky predicting whatever, but it happened. And he's gotten more attention from that. He says that the tragedy of great power politics, one of his, maybe his most well-known book, and you can look at it in terms of what Putin is trying to do today. The hegemons don't give up power. They want to maintain control. And the United States, since certainly the end of World War II, has been the hegemonic power in Asia for a number of reasons. The rise of China is conflicting with that. We're seeing it in the Philippines. We're seeing it in Korea. We're seeing it in Japan. We're seeing it off of Vietnam. We're seeing it around the whole area of China. The rise of China and the United States, what's it doing? Is it going to be able to control the situation there? One reason why Putin, obviously, to give him some a little bit of the doubt, is that the Ukraine, that area has been historically the way that others have come into Russia, the near far, the worry that if NATO forces are right at the border, we got problems. Well, on that, his view, offensive realism. He says, politics is about one thing, it's about power. It's about power and control. It's about your own self-interest. Nations, he said, are not out there to make it a better world. They're out there to protect their own self-interest. And they create power and they will defend it. The long and short of this, he predicts there will be a shooting war between the United States and China within 30 years when he wrote this. He says there's bound to be, because China is rising, the United States is going flat or down. He said the United States is going to protect its interests, and they're going to try to maintain their power in the Pacific, and China's increasingly running into it. We see it now. We're at a point where one false move could lead to problems. We see planes chasing each other. We see incidents, ships coming at each other, playing chicken, playing games. One false macho move, hey, I'm going to show you I can do it and you can't. Where does that go? And what exacerbates this, that Mearsheimer points out, the military hardware that the sides have get bigger and bigger. Toys for boys, they want to use them. They're going to have them there. We put in the hands of individuals, one false move could lead to catastrophic events. And he tends to point out, his view is that this rise of China and the flattening of America is bound to lead to a clash that will not be resolved politically. He says it's bound to happen. And I just put that out there, not to say that's going to happen, but this is a well-respected man who takes a hard-nosed line to what's going on there. So what happened? Best case scenario, I think, low percentage, worst case low, cautious optimism, what is it, total cop-out, right? But part of it. I would probably put a little higher on that. So the question though, how do you hedge your bet if you're a business person? Because the market is there. The market is clearly there. Those earlier statistics, the population, et cetera, the growth. If you're in business, you gotta grow. That's where the markets are. A couple of last points. A comment that Soviets, Russians say he never made it, but one of his friends said he did. Lenin's famous comment, we will hang the capitalists with the rope that they sell us at a huge profit. You know, are we, for business reasons, transferring technology, know-how, whatever, to a nation that's going to use that ultimately results in our own denigration? It's something to think about. A question, what are the real interests of the United States in this? I find it interesting. Many of you are aware that Bloomberg, perhaps you're aware, that essentially fired 4 of its journalists who wrote articles talking about the accumulation of wealth by the political elite, party elite. By the way, when I say party, it's not just few people. There are about 75 million members of the Communist Party in China. You can't go anywhere unless you're a member. It's not as if there's like 500 people. But yet this massive accumulation of wealth. Bloomberg's chairman, and certainly Michael Bloomberg didn't stand up and say, no, he's wrong. The company, i.e. Bloomberg, should have reconsidered articles that deviated from its core coverage of business news because they jeopardized the huge sales potential for its products in the Chinese market. It's all about money. The values don't count. If we can make money there, the democracy shit that out there, that's not what we're in it for money. Is that an issue where the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we hang them? Are we, our own values, so monetarily skewed that we're willing to kind of blink, look the other way when we see these abnegation of rights that we take personally as part and parcel of what America's all about, that we would like to see extended in the world? Are we doing that, perhaps? Good luck, and go Bears. I could say a lot more.
My name is Joel Spolin.
Yes, Joel.
Does China consider itself a communist country or a capitalist country?
First of all, does it consider itself a country? The Chinese Communist Party says there is no China. They say there's a Communist Party. The country is us. We own the country. We are the country. There is no country outside the party. That's one thing. They are adamant that they are China, and that anything happens in China, it's the Communist Party that owns it, controls it. It's, what's the term they use, Joel? I'm sure you've heard it. Socialist, capitalism with the socialist face. One of the interesting things in China is that a guy named Fan Fan, who is one of the most popular bloggers, people wonder if it's somebody else writing it. He says everybody knows in China, the leadership, nobody believes in that shit of socialism. Nobody does at the highest. But he said, the idea, if you pretend you do, you'll be okay. Pay lip service, but it's all about making money. In that concept, I think that the view is, because if you look at the classical of Marx, of Lenin, nobody plays them out. Power to the people, right. Unions, yeah, right. Power to the people, they don't have it. I don't think they believe in the views of socialism, Joel, as one would interpret that. And I think it's very, it always surprises me how Mao ever won. Because China, almost DNA, are risk takers or entrepreneurs who are out there. We see certainly here, maybe we do see only a certain portion of the country, those who have left, the entrepreneurial class. But this is very much part of China's history, was that. And it surprises me that Mao was able to win and stay in power for as long as he did in pushing down a lot of the capitalist impulse that's out there. That'd be a short answer. And yeah, want to come up to the mic, it might be easier. Oh, did you have a question, sir? Did you have one? You'll be next. Okay.
Matt Fogarty, 2001. So if you did the same slide deck in China with a group of business school guys over there, would you have the same reaction?
Yes, that's a good question. I used to, when I started doing this, when I first went over there, a guy I met when I was teaching an executive ed class at Wharton, and a guy who had a Wharton MBA, Chinese, who was the director of the EMBA program at SEEBS. He said, oh, because he heard this, oh, this is great, come over and do this. And I did it for a few years, and then it wasn't stated directly, but it was made very clear. These are not the things that one should be saying in China. Fine, their country, but I didn't want to do that. The reason this guy first invited me over, when I talked about the background, Deng Xiaoping, he said, I never knew this. Nobody knows this. China has maintained this position by absolutely controlling the flow of information at public levels, absolutely controlling it. One of the things, when the Arab Spring broke out a couple of years ago, everything controlled. Somebody, a secretary perhaps at the Politburo, leaked a memo of the notes that were taken at the meeting of the Politburo. What do we deal with this? We come up with a standard line. Everything in the Middle East has been created, the Arab Spring, what was going on was created by the CIA in order to drive up energy prices, in order to hurt China, because they're dependent. That's the official line. It's not accident, and this again is where I would have you think about, yes, you can make money, but what's the longer term cost to America on values like this? So the answer to that is that it's one reason I'd love to go back. I've taught there, I've done some lectures, but I was not invited back. As somebody said, you're not a friend of China. And much of what I learned about some of the corruption came from the students I had. There was a woman in the class that I remember. She was Zhang, whatever, because they adopted her Western first name. She had gone to Fudan, one of the top schools. Both of her parents were professors there. She'd gotten her degree, CS, went to work for went to work for IBM in Hong Kong, 7-8 years, got a better offer at Cisco, went to Cisco in the financial vertical in Shanghai, making a ton of money. She said it cost her marriage. Her husband was an ophthalmologist. She said, I was making so much more money than him, he couldn't take it. So that ended. She wanted to get into management, and they said, no, you can't go into management because you're doing too well. So she left, and she went to China Telecom. And she went there, and she said when she interviewed, that money came up, and China Telecom publicly traded. By the way, any publicly traded other than a Western firm, China, the SOEs that are publicly traded, they're not publicly traded. They're publicly traded, you can buy shares, but the party controls them. There is a line, you can get an annual report, you see the leadership, what you never see, the party leadership. At every one of these firms, equal to the CEO chairman is a party official, their own hierarchy. Nothing of substance is done by the business side unless the party person agrees to it. Well, she said there, they talked about salary, they said, don't worry. Once a month, somebody came to her office, put an envelope on her desk, stuffed with cash. She said, I had salary, I was actually getting 3 times more. And she said, did you know that China Telecom owns water utilities all over China? I said, no. She said, nobody knows it. That's where we get all the cash. She said, if I'm getting this amount, how much are they getting above me? She wanted to move into a senior position. To do it, you had to be a member of the party. And she said it was so ridiculous. One person can blackball. You don't sufficiently know Xing Zemin's 3 represents, the paper he did. She said it's so dumb. It's like, she said, what are these? I remember saying, those dumb things you have in American fraternities, you can be blackballed. But if you didn't want to do that, you're not going to go anywhere. The control of the situation on that. Question, sir.
Yeah, I'm an MBA 04. My name is Egan. I've been living in Beijing for the last 6 years, so I've seen some experience the growth of China for quite a bit.
Yes.
But still, I think there's definitely some difference. Like China has been encountering fatal crisis throughout the last 30 years. Right? It's just one after another. Right now, maybe political reform will be the latest one. But I can still see the age of relying on, I think, expansion, growth is going away. That means in the past, there will be dividends from population growth, like geo expansion, opening more stores can drive more growth, but these are going away. So I think the old formula is the first time that I see it doesn't work anymore. I mean, growing to solve problem. So given this, I think this is a kind of like paradigm shift. Do you see this as a factor to impact your definition of soft landing and all this?
Yeah, I know it's a good point. Now, I do think growth is there, but the government is consciously pushing the go-out strategy, encouraging indigenous Chinese firms to go abroad, to start establishing routes to become more, to do that. Same time, what do we also know they're doing? Pushing more internal consumption. Don't have just an export-led growth. A lot of the go-out strategy is for Chinese firms to actually engage in DFI, to go, don't just export, buy companies or establish operations, physical plants, products, hiring people, et cetera, abroad. That's one. But really try to ramp up internal consumption, become less dependent on exports for growth. So I think that's there. But I think the other side, my own view, China will never be able to really move forward until the party lets go. I think that's just the way. I don't think you can control an economy that big, that many people, as I said, by a handful of bureaucrats. They've got to let go. And that's the issue. We don't know. How much is Xi Jinping really a reformer? Because you read the headlines going after the most blatant cases of corruption, etc. Are these show trials or is it real? Is it just throwing a few things, oh, look, I'm going to do this, but does he really mean it? This remains an issue, and it's not going to be solved overnight. As I said before, I think you accumulate wealth like that. The wealth of the elite is overwhelming in China, overwhelming. Do you give it up easily? How do you begin to devolve towards greater distribution where you don't rip it off? My answer, this is where I think factual data and opinions come in. Your own perceptions, where it's going and what's happening on that. What you see. I see underneath the surface lots of tension. Worst case, it erupts in something. It's interesting. In 1989, with Tiananmen Square, much of the Chinese position on that, it had nothing to do with, we want democracy, the papier-mâché Statue of Liberty. China had been growing in the 80s. And we had some problems in the West, 87, October 19th, 1987, market tanked, a lot of things happened, slowed down, China growth slowed down. Their interpretation, jobs weren't available for college graduates, so they got furious and they rioted. Nothing to do with demand for freedom, everything about where's the economic growth so I can leverage my education to get into the game. One interpretation, that Tiananmen Square was a reflection, we have to keep growing. And I think this other issue then, to end on this very interesting question, part of the issue, go back to social unrest. When Hu Jintao was the prior president, his official theme was the harmonious society. And he said, we have got to bring the Western provinces into the game, give them the economic opportunity that we've had, encouraging firms to expand into Xi'an, into Chongqing, into the Western areas that had more or less remained agrarian. Much of what was the percentage of victory of the Communist Party in the last election? Oh, whoops, I forgot something. There was no election. The only legitimacy of the party is to keep the economy growing, to expand the well-being of its citizens. If it slows down, they're in trouble because it's not legitimated by a vote. It's legitimated. People in China, the ones I met, don't want to go out and revolt. Some do, they're more intellectuals. But others, they say, I want this stuff. If it slows down, what happens? And what happens to the still? Give China all the credit in the world. 350 million people lifted out of poverty in a generation. Unheard of. Good news, bad news, only 1 billion to go. That's the problem. How do you keep the train running so that the others get their opportunity? Growth remains, I think, fundamental. Economic growth to the ability of the party to stay in power. Can it grow according to the, quote, rules? The rules of the game that the world economy plays by? Or does it have to skew it in its favor by currency manipulation, keeping out a lot of sectors that essentially allow for the monopolies by SOEs where they're not truly open markets, and by the elite ripping off the rent of some of these companies to just enrich themselves and buy homes outside the US. That remains the issue on that. But I think growth, they still have to, because there's still, as I said, that huge number of farmers and others who want to get into the game. And you got to grow to do that. Can they grow internally enough? So I think I'm one last one out of time. Do you want to use, is there a microphone right there?
Bryn Hadler, class of 2009. Speaking of wanting to buy homes in other places, I live in Sydney, Australia, and there's like a huge housing boom there, which is, largely fueled by Chinese investment. And Australians seem to think that, this housing boom's never going to end. And a lot of American investors or economists have come over and said, you know what, China's going to have a housing crash and it's going to take down the Australian housing market. And I'm just wondering what your view is on that.
Well, as somebody who bought a home in Florida in 2007, I might not be the best person to ask on that. Yeah, well, I literally what's today, April, I sold it 7 weeks ago for only a $400,000 loss, but that's a different story. We had, what am I getting? We had those who do, they do. Those who don't do, they teach. But aside from that, listen, that in that context, we had our own crisis in that. I think there is, again, there's a lot being written out there that China's on the verge of this bubble bursting. And a lot of it doesn't show up officially. Why? Where did the money come from? People lending to friends. The clique, the community, the clan, lending amongst themselves, off the book, so to speak. You put all of your money into your cousin who's done this and is gone. That could have a bad ending on that. A lot of the numbers we have on the mortgage markets in China, and a lot of it are paid for in cash, by the way, a lot of the ownership, as I said, it could just crash and there's going to be a lot of problems out there. 2 years ago, that number I gave you, 65 million unoccupied housing units. And it's reached the point that this is standard. That 60-minute story, 2 months ago, 3 months ago, the ghost cities, just tower after tower. When I taught at CEIPS in Pudong, very nice area, and I remember the first year I taught there, God, these beautiful, modern, tall condos, apartments, whatnot. One of the students worked for a real estate finance company. He said, I can get you a loan if you want to buy one. Another said, walk around at night. You'll notice something. What's that? No lights are on. They're all spec. That woman I mentioned who worked at China Tele, she owned 5 homes. Part of it was why? Because you couldn't take money out of the country. So a way to invest was in real estate. You had artificially huge amounts of money going into real estate because lack of alternatives for those making money, and it drove up the price. It created the bubble. Another reason why it went into that, and one of the issues in banking, many in China don't want money in the bank. Why? Then somebody knows what you have. Somebody's called the government. They don't want the government to know how much money they have. So these provide perhaps off the books, private loans. But your basic point, what happens if it does start to crash? There's no, not that we had a real nice safety net, but they don't have any of that there. That could exacerbate, quote unquote, social unrest. Last point on that, we're out of time. You guys have to go. But what I said earlier, how do you hedge your bet on this? The economics, the growth, you're in business, you want to grow, the market, the population, the wealth, my God, you got to be in China. But your last point's a good one. You can't go like that forever. You can't go like that forever. How do you look at some of these downsides? I don't want China to end, you don't want China to end. But we don't want China to say, there are two sets of rules. Here's what we get to play by, you have to play by a different set. We need a common level playing field. China isn't there yet. And one hopes it'll get there. One hopes that Xi Jinping is the reformer that the PR spin gives him that credit. I'm from Missouri, so to speak, on that one. I want to see the proof is in the pudding, and it's going to take a lot more than some PR stuff. It'll take more than that. Good luck to all of you. Give a lot of money to Haas. Thank you.